Well, let's go to Dr. Jo Ford, Senior Africa Analyst at Oxford Analytica, joining us this evening. Thank you for joining us. So when you hear that 300 or so troops are going to help train to tackle the situation there, what are your thoughts?
Well, a lot of the talk, of course, has been about mission creep. I guess my first reaction is that one has to think what the alternatives were, for example, for Britain in its present relationship with Europe to not act in a way that supports the EU, supports France in this action. And then there's also the question, I guess, of a window of opportunity to achieve some of the things that were laid out by the government today. But the mission creep question, I suppose, comes from the sense that one never controls everything in a conflict dynamic, but the one thing that the French, that the EU, that the United Kingdom doesn't control here is the speed and quality of deployment of African troops, of training of Malian troops. And so a lot of the contingencies around the length and the nature of the operation turn on the readiness of Malian troops, the readiness of West African troops. And
are there any predictors that indicate to you at this stage how things might go?
Well, there's a lot of implicit in mission creep, or related to mission creep, is the question of analogies of war and the use of other conflicts. So we hear talk of this is the Afghanistan of Africa. William Hague spoke of the analogy of Somalia, where you have African troops, EU-funded African troops, fighting to some extent in a jihadist context. There are limits to those analogies. There are demographic limits in West Africa. There are geographic limits to the analogy with Afghanistan in terms of terrain. There are geopolitical limits to that analogy, because Afghanistan was a highly globalized conflict from the time the Soviets were involved. There were major states supporting different actors. I think a more appropriate question than mission creep is the question of self-fulfilling prophecy, because one of the dangers in a situation like that, like we have in Mali, is that one gives to one's enemy exactly what they're after, which is the internationalization of an issue, the pulling in of Western forces that create in themselves a magnet to some extent for those who seek to target those forces.
And on the issue of internationalization, it's interesting that France is leading the way on this. America not involved in any direct way at the moment. Some have said that the world's policeman needs to be back in force. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, there are all sorts of US domestic political reasons, or at least there were until November 2012. I think to some extent one can understand the US position as an exercise in restraint, precisely because of that danger of that self-fulfilling prophecy. So one talks about Al-Qaeda-linked militants. What one's really dealing with in Mali is some Al-Qaeda-linked militants in the context of a civil war, in effect. Most of the participants in the conflict in Mali are Malians. Most of them have an agenda that isn't transnational yet. It isn't an international agenda. And so one of the challenges for France, for the West in general, will be distinguishing between its narrow counterterrorism goals that affected Western interests around the world, and conducting a counterinsurgency in the context of a civil war, and in Mali's case, in the context of a coup-led government. So one of the questions is really the precedent that it sets on military-to-military cooperation with a coup-led government, and some of the political reconciliation, political inclusion issues that are not solved by force.
Dr. Jo Ford, thank you.